Hello, and welcome to another episode of Innovation Minutes Live. I'm Dan, and I'm joined by my co-host Anna. And today we're talking about what we've casually been calling the lost generation, or this generation in between Gen X and Gen Y, which we're both a part of. And this was actually our suspicions were confirmed with a recent article terming this generation, I believe it was the Xennials or something like that, right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and I think for individuals that kind of fall into that overlap, because there's some discrepancy as to when someone believes a new generation starts. It's not like at the stroke of midnight on a particular year. Obviously, it's a gradual thing, and so when you happen to fall within the years, because it's years, not months, that transition is happening. I think a lot of times you can identify with both the generation before you and the generation after you. And one of the most distinguishing characteristics of this particular generational shift has to do with our relationships with technology. So the Gen Xers did not grow up, the older Gen Xers did not grow up with technology, and it was not really a part of their lives even when they started the workforce. Whereas, of course, millennials are more often regarded as digital natives. And then you have this in between, this sort of lost generation who didn't grow up with technology, but started using it actively end of high school and in college. And that makes us, in a way, the sort of go-betweens for these two mindsets.
Yeah, and to be clear, we're talking about, I believe it's the years 1977 to around 82. Is that
83, I think.
83, the bracket we're talking about. So this is the group of people who were born to sometimes baby boomers, but also not quite baby boomers, right? So we also don't necessarily have that baggage that we bring along with us. So, I think, we talked about it. This is a little bit self-serving because we're both actually part of this generation. And I think we've always felt independently a little bit conflicted about, which group we identify with, right? Because we have this really large group of the population that's known as the millennials or Gen Y. And, they exhibit all of these different types of habits. And then you have Gen X, who were in most cases like our older cousins or older brothers or sisters or whatever, who grew up before us, and there's that whole thing that was direct descendants of the baby boomers and stuff. So I think, like you mentioned, we often find ourselves kind of stuck in the middle, right? Like these two generations are pulling us in different ways, and I think we share some of the attributes, like the article pointed out, which I think was accurate. But at the same time, we also have to play a little bit of a liaison or a translator between the two groups. Right, because we're not working with both of them professionally.
Absolutely. I think this is where it becomes relevant from a discussion about generations within corporations, because you still have a lot of these boomers and older Gen Xers who are still largely in the leadership positions, and the new hires are increasingly the Gen Y or the millennials. And so, you see a lot of stuff written and talked about this great divide. How can they possibly understand each other?
Right.
And so it's interesting to consider the people that are in this in-between place as these sort of go-betweens, as the translators between these cultures. And what does that look like within an organization, and how might that actually be facilitated internally? Because sometimes you don't feel that you speak the same language. I mean, and this has been riffed on, in memes and many other spoofs about this kind of disconnect on both parts. And so what do you do when you feel you don't speak the language of your coworkers?
Right. Well, and I think you bring up a good point. I think it's a valid question about, what does the organization that is, managed more or less by Gen X and, it's powered more or less by Gen Y. What does that organization look like? What does it look like today? And what does it look like in 10 years from now as these organizations start to supplant the older school organizations that are today still run by the baby boomer generation and people in that sect. So,
and of course the other element being who you're serving, right? So it's like, here's how it's operating internally, but then whatever your product or service is, who's your audience?
Right, they're all selling to Gen Z.
So then it just becomes even more confusing. Yeah, I think, you know, we would love to hear how the generational divide is currently addressed within your organization, either from an internal personnel perspective or with regard to better understanding the communities that you're serving, and what you think about this lost generation and the possibilities of how it might be able to bridge that gap. So please find us in the comments and let us know your thoughts.
Yep, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.